Cruise ships are supposed to be impossible to ignore. They are literal floating cities, glowing monoliths carrying thousands of people across the ocean. They cost billions of dollars to build, and they're engineered to look completely untouchable. But every single year, some of these giant ships quietly disappear. They are abandoned in remote ports, left drifting offshore, or sold for scrap, dismantled like they never mattered at all. So, how does a billion-dollar asset suddenly become totally unwanted? And why are some of the largest, most luxurious structures on Earth being left behind in the dark? To understand how a city of steel vanishes, you first have to understand just how invincible this industry used to look. For decades, the cruise business wasn't just growing, it was exploding. It became an arms race of pure excess. Shipping lines weren't just building boats anymore. They were building floating amusement parks, mega malls, and five-star resorts packed into a single hull. Every new vessel had to be bigger, taller, and more jaw-dropping than the last. And the money? It was staggering. A single megaship could pull in millions of dollars a week in pure profit. To the outside world, these companies were printing cash, completely immune to the economic forces that plague businesses on dry land. But behind the luxury, hidden beneath the neon lights and the endless buffets, the business model was becoming dangerously fragile. And almost nobody saw the structural cracks until it was already too late. Cruise ships are a miracle of engineering, but economically, they are terrifying. To make a profit, these floating cities have to run like clockwork, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The moment they stop moving, they start bleeding cash at a rate that would bankrupt most traditional businesses in a matter of weeks. Think about the math behind a single voyage. A standard megaship burns through hundreds of thousands of dollars in fuel every single day. Then there are the thousands of staff members who need to be paid, fed, and housed. Add in the staggering cost of constant maritime maintenance, port fees, food supply chains, and the massive corporate debt taken on just to build the ship in the first place. Cruise ships only work when almost everything goes perfectly. The entire business model relies on a terrifyingly razor-thin margin, high occupancy. If a ship sails even 10% empty, the profit margin doesn't just shrink, it completely evaporates. Every cabin must be filled, and every passenger needs to be buying drinks, booking excursions, and spending money in the casinos. But what happens when the passengers disappear, but the bills don't? You can't just turn off a cruise ship like a car and leave it in a garage. Even a parked ship requires a skeleton crew, constant power, and millions of dollars in monthly upkeep just to keep the salt water from corroding the hull. The industry was walking an economic tightrope, blind to the fact that the wind was about to blow. And then, almost overnight, everything stopped. It started with a whisper, and then, the entire global fleet slammed into a brick wall. When the world locked down, the cruise industry didn't just slow down, it completely froze. Almost overnight, billions of dollars in revenue vanished, but the staggering overhead costs remained exactly the same. What followed was a surreal, chaotic maritime crisis. Ports around the world suddenly slammed their gates shut. Massive ships, filled with thousands of panicked passengers, found themselves trapped at sea, radioactive to global authorities. They became modern-day Flying Dutchmen, drifting endlessly in international waters, begging for permission to dock while their fuel supplies ticked down. Once the passengers were finally evacuated, an even stranger horror movie unfolded. The oceans became crowded with ghosts. Because ports charge exorbitant fees to tie up a ship, cruise lines couldn't afford to dock their fleets. Instead, hundreds of the largest vessels on Earth were forced to anchor miles offshore in cluster formations, visible from space. They sat there, dark, silent, and entirely empty. Inside, the grand ballrooms were pitch black. The slot machines were muted. The massive water parks were drained of water. Every single day these ships sat idle. They burned through millions of dollars in maintenance, insurance, and the skeletal crews required by maritime law to keep them afloat. The financial bleeding was catastrophic. The world's largest cruise lines were burning through billions of dollars a month just to keep dead weight floating. Very quickly, the math changed from a question of recovery to a brutal game of survival. Some ships became too expensive to even keep parked. And that's when the hard choices had to be made. This is where the true mystery of the modern ghost ship begins. When a cruise line faces total bankruptcy, or when keeping a specific vessel afloat costs more than its projected future revenue, the corporate entities involved do something shocking: they walk away. Suddenly, these multi-billion-dollar engineering marvels are treated like hazardous waste. Some ships are quietly steered to offshore parking zones, maritime graveyards located in international waters where regulations are loose and oversight is non-existent. They are dropped off, anchored, and left behind. A skeleton crew of a few dozen workers is often left on board to keep the generators running and pump out water. But when the money dries up completely, even those crews are abandoned. History has seen ghost crews trapped on floating metal islands for months, running out of food and water, waiting for a corporate owner that no longer exists to pay them. Over time, the salt water takes over. Rust stains bleed down the side of pristine white hulls. The luxurious carpets grow thick with mold from the stagnant, humid air. The grand theaters and winding promenades become completely silent, rotting from the inside out. It is an eerie, deeply unnatural sight. But looking at these rotting behemoths raises an obvious, frustrating question. If these ships cost hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars to design and build, why abandon them? Why not just sell them to another company, or repurpose them into floating hotels, housing, or student dorms? Why let a literal fortune rot into the sea? The answer reveals the brutal, hidden reality of how these ships are actually constructed. The truth is, a cruise ship is not built like a building on land. It is a highly specialized, rapidly aging machine. Once a ship passes a certain age, or stays dark for too long, refurbishing it becomes a financial death sentence. The plumbing, the wiring, the massive diesel engines, they are deeply integrated into the steel chassis. You cannot easily upgrade them. So, when a ship loses its value, it enters the darkest, most brutal corner of the maritime world, the shipbreaking yards. Instead of being saved, these former palaces of luxury are sold for a fraction of their original cost to yards in places like Ulung, India, or Aliaga, Turkey. The process of destroying them is terrifyingly low-tech. Captains take the wheel one final time, rev the engines to maximum speed, and intentionally crash the multi-billion-dollar vessels directly onto muddy beaches at high tide. The moment the ship grinds to a halt in the mud, its life is over. Within hours, armies of workers equipped with gas torches descend upon the hull like parasites. They breach the sides, carving open holes into the luxury suites. They pull out everything of value: teakwood, copper wiring, flat-screen TVs, industrial kitchen equipment, and grand pianos. Everything is auctioned off to the highest bidder. Then comes the heavy metal. The massive steel plates that once protected thousands of vacationers from the fury of the ocean are cut away piece by piece, falling into the mud below to be melted down into rebar. Some luxury ships survive less than 20 years before being torn apart. It is a violent, unceremonious end for structures that were once heralded as the pinnacle of human luxury. $1 billion of engineering, reduced to scrap metal in a matter of months. The dust from the Great Collapse has settled, but the fundamental danger hasn't gone away. If anything, the stakes are higher than they have ever been. Today, cruise lines are building even bigger megaships, behemoths that dwarf the vessels of the past decade. They feature entire neighborhoods, simulated skydiving, and central parks with thousands of real plants. But these architectural marvels come with an astronomical price tag, often crossing the $2 billion mark for a single ship. To fund this relentless expansion, cruise companies have taken on mountains of corporate debt. They are betting everything on a flawless, uninterrupted future. But the world is becoming increasingly unpredictable. Fuel prices are volatile, environmental regulations are tightening, and economic pressures are squeezing consumer spending. The modern cruise industry is operating on a scale so massive that even a minor disruption can trigger a catastrophic financial domino effect. Which begs the question, could this happen again? Are we just one global crisis away from seeing the next generation of megaships, vessels twice the size of the ones rotting today, turned into dead weight? The economic equations haven't changed. The margins are still razor thin, the overhead is still terrifying, and the salt water never stops eating away at the steel. Cruise ships were designed to feel permanent. They were built to be triumphant symbols of human engineering, floating worlds constructed to carry thousands of people across the deepest oceans in absolute luxury. When you look at one lit up against the night sky, it feels completely indestructible. But the global economy is a brutal, uncaring machine. When the money disappears, the illusion of permanence fades fast. Even cities can be abandoned. Even palaces can be forgotten. And somewhere right now, in a quiet port, or a lonely stretch of international water, another multi-billion-dollar ship is sitting completely silent, just waiting to become the next ghost of the cruise industry.